There's a lot of talk about the dignity of the worker, but that dignity of the worker is not a dignity that's predicated upon some egalitarian fantasy where everybody has everything equally in common, or really, in a sense, nobody owns anything but the state. No, instead, the dignity of the worker is rooted in his or her identity as being in the image and likeness of God and being productive, not being inert and receiving, but discovering their vocation and using the gifts and talents that they receive from God for their fulfillment and the benefit of those in their immediate circle and beyond. But in order to do that, private property is key. And the church's social teaching in economics has always recognized this. Private property is a natural right. It's ineradicable. Of course, you can be punished. Some punishments remove certain rights, but it is in human nature to be able to possess private property, and your ability to dispose of your goods as you see fit, guided with a well-formed conscience, enable you to discover your vocation. So private property, in a sense, isn't something that you acquire merely after you work, but private property is really front-loaded in a sense. In order for you to discover your vocation in the first place, you need to possess goods that enable you to discover what you're good at and get formation in that, and then pursue it and benefit yourself and others. So yes, private property is at the center, at the foundation of the dignity of the worker and the dignity of being a co-creator in God's image. One of the more recent and very helpful places to look, I find, is Leo XIII's encyclical Rerum Novarum from 1891. He was writing that encyclical just as socialism was a burgeoning movement. And Marxist socialism was predicated on, or its foundation is, envy, class envy, fomenting and whipping people up into an envy, using terms like wage slaves as if their dignity was violated. And yes, there had been at times violations in capitalism and free market of people's dignity, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but the envy response, and then the solution to that envy of socialism, where the state controls the means of production in the name of the people possessing it, and egalitarianism was a horrible and frankly, and this is not an exaggeration, diabolical solution. Why? Well, envy is one of the capital sins, one of the 7 deadly sins. The answer is to injustices is both forgiveness, but also rectifying the injustice. Envy and vengeance is not the answer, but justice, which may include punitive measures, is. So Leo was trying to deal with that burgeoning movement of socialism, and he laid down the foundation of the church's economic teaching in the modern period in that encyclical Rerum Novarum. And that foundation is it's a virtuous mean between 2 extremes, 2 vices. On the one hand, socialism, which he unequivocally condemns. Popes before him had condemned it, he condemned it, and it's been condemned as intrinsically immoral all the way through to John Paul II and beyond. That's the one extreme. And why is that condemnable? Because not only does it foment envy, or it hinges on whipping people into an envious frenzy, but also because it violates the human right to private property, and it also violates something called subsidiarity. Subsidiarity is a fancy term, but it simply means this, that things in life, the business of life, ought to be handled on as local and small a level as possible, as reasonable. If there's injustices, if there are injustices or bigger problems or bigger needs that are legitimate, then a higher authority like a city, state, or federal governmental body could step in, But ordinarily you want the individuals to be free, So that's the idea of a free market. The free market, or free, capitalism and that kind of freedom, is freedom from unreasonable involvement of the government. Now, pursuit of private property and proper subsidiarity has to be conducted under the rule of law, and so that addresses the other extreme vice that Leo was hitting upon. And that was, and there were some instances of this in the 19th century, to be sure, with industrialization taking off. There were some injustices on the part of employers toward employees, bad working conditions, et cetera. And so those have to be addressed, and he called for those to be addressed. Sometimes those conditions come out of greed, or there can be deceit or fraud in contracts, or all sorts of problems. But what is not condemned is capitalism, is the free market. Socialism is intrinsically evil because it violates private property and subsidiarity. But the excesses of capitalism are condemned, while capitalism itself is not condemned. Now, keep in mind, too, that Leo was writing this encyclical prior to decades of, last century plus, decades of the unfolding of grand socialist experiments in Soviet Russia and in Europe and in South America and in Eastern Asia. He didn't see that unfold, but what he knew is that you take away people's private property, you make a state-controlled economy, you're gonna infantilize people. You're taking away their dignity. And you're also dehumanizing them. And that kind of dehumanizing, when the state thinks it knows what you should be doing with your life better than you yourself know, then that causes all sorts of problems. Some of them are kind of perhaps funny, like you have a bunch of blue jeans being sent to Moscow when they really need bricks, and you have a bunch of bricks being sent to some other town in Soviet Russia when they actually need blue jeans, right? And that's kind of funny. And Thomas Sowell, in his great book, Basic Economics, talks about these things. But it's not funny when it gets to the level of the dehumanization of people, which has led consistently, and Leo hadn't seen this yet, but he knew that there's fundamental problems with socialism. It led to systemic mass murder. Millions upon millions of people under Stalin, under Lenin, under Stalin, under Mao, had been systematically executed. Mass genocide. It wasn't just the Nazis. That was bad too. It was also the Soviets. So communism is a failed project. Whereas capitalism, conducted under the rule of law, both the natural law and God's revealed law, the Ten Commandments, actually lifts people out of poverty. What I understand about the dignity of the worker, it's predicated upon two things: naturally being in the image and likeness of God, and supernaturally being called, first of all, being redeemed by Christ on the cross. Everybody has that opportunity to be redeemed. He died for everyone, and everyone is called to the beatific vision in heaven. So the dignity of humans is predicated upon being in his image and being called to eternal life. Part of the way to attain our final end, through obviously conversion, faith in Christ, living in a state of grace, is also to be faithful to the duties of our state in life, which includes work, right? So the dignity involves being a person in the image and likeness of God. That's the dignity. The dignity doesn't consist in quantity of money, but it does consist in part in being remunerated reasonably for your work. So, for example, you'll hear this. People will say, everyone, as Leo the 13th says in Rerum Novarum, everyone should have a living wage. All workers ought to have a living wage, a wage with which they can support a spouse and children. And if they're not receiving that, then their dignity is violated, and it's unjust. But that fails to take into account the fact that there are transitional jobs. In other words, what Leo is saying is a job that you will be committed to as your principal occupation for perhaps the rest of your life, those kinds of jobs should have a living wage. It doesn't mean you have to have a wage that enables you to purchase all sorts of things, but enough to live and educate and shelter and house and clothe your family. That wouldn't be a summer job if you had a summer job at McDonald's. Now, it could be being a manager at McDonald's. Maybe that's my lifelong, and I could have a living wage there, right? So there's these distinctions that are so important, and I see even in classical distributism a failure to recognize these nuances. There's a too hasty judgment that dignity of workers being violated because ostensibly it seems that there's perhaps an injustice. It requires a lot of thought, and it's difficult. It's difficult, especially applying these principles to concrete situations. It's very difficult. Should there be a minimum wage? What should it be? These are not easy decisions to make. I'm glad I don't have to make them. So subsidiarity in the context of a business or an institution, an educational institution, for example, means that the decision-making process would be delegated to the lowest reasonable level. So the reason being, the persons who are most familiar with the problem are the ones who ought to make the decision. If they make bad decisions, you can bump it up a level of oversight to address the issues. This works in families too. Families, businesses, the church. It should be working this way in the church and in society. If you have a manager or a CEO or a university president or a dean who's micromanaging to the point where it really is, again, infantilizing or kind of dehumanizing the person. They can't make their own decision. They're just kind of an automaton. They have to just do what the higher-up said. And then there's so often the case where had the person with authority only have known X or Y or Z, they wouldn't have asked me to do this, you see. How many of us have been in that position? That's not uncommon. And that's the idea of subsidiarity, is that the decision-making process and the execution ought to be done on the most local level possible. Now, sometimes it does have to be a bigger, higher level. You have to go, let's say in the government, to state or federal level. But generally, that the principle is you work it out at the lowest possible level. The two extremes that we have to avoid as Catholics in economic pursuits are the envy that's at the root of state socialism, the class envy. On the other extreme, the injustices that could happen on the part of employers toward employees, the vice is greed. And these are two capital sins, two of the 7 deadly sins, envy and greed. The Catholic Church's social teaching with respect to the economy is the mean in between the two. And it really is, as JP2 eloquently says in Centesimus Annus, the free market. Capitalism under the rule of law, under the rule of natural law, under the rule of divine law.